And people see that with Eamonn and I on TV, you know. So I say, well, we don't row, actually. And people say, oh, they argue. I say, we don't. It's just I don't always agree with him. And just because he's my husband, I'll never always agree with him. And I can't be that person that doesn't voice that opinion.
Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford seemed unshakable, the kind of marriage that made people believe in forever, steady, reliable, admired by millions. When they announced their divorce, the world was stunned. There had been no signs, no scandals. Nothing. Ruth spoke first, her version sounded reasonable, and everyone believed her. Eamonn said nothing, and his silence felt like guilt. Now Eamonn Holmes has finally broken that silence, and what he reveals changes everything people thought they knew. What was really happening behind closed doors? Join us as we expose the truth of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. A marriage built on performance. Everyone thought they knew Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford, the breakfast television couple who smiled at each other across the sofa every morning, laughing at the same jokes and finishing each other's sentences in a way that made viewers feel comfortable. But comfort is not the same as closeness. For over 20 years, their relationship existed mostly on camera, meeting at work, falling in love at work, getting married while working together, and then continuing year after year, broadcasting their marriage to millions of people who believed they were watching something real. Maybe it was real once, before the cameras became part of the furniture, when there were private moments that belonged only to them, quiet mornings and inside jokes. The kind of intimacy that does not need an audience. But television has a way of swallowing things whole. When you are paid to be charming together 5 days a week, charm stops being spontaneous and becomes a muscle you exercise, a skill you refine, learning which stories get laughs, which glances the camera loves, which version of yourselves the audience wants to see. And slowly, without realizing it, that version becomes the only version you know how to be. Eamonn and Ruth were professionals who understood what the job required: chemistry on demand, banter that felt natural but hit its marks, a marriage that looked effortless because they had practiced it so many times. Because when your relationship is also your brand, it becomes difficult to separate what is genuine from what is simply good television. You stop asking whether you are happy and start asking whether you look happy, and if the audience believes it, does the truth even matter? No one suspected anything was wrong because nothing ever looked wrong. No public arguments, no scandals, no rumors, just two people who had been together so long that their presence beside each other seemed inevitable. But inevitability is not love, it is just familiarity that has lasted long enough to feel permanent. The danger of performing a marriage is that eventually the performance replaces the reality. You stop checking in with each other because you already know your lines. You stop being curious because you assume you know everything. You stop growing because growth would disrupt the routine. They stopped talking about the things that mattered. Stopped asking each other how they really felt. Because the answer might have been too complicated, too messy, too real for two people who had spent decades pretending everything was fine, until one day, the pretending stopped working. The divorce announcement came without warning, one short statement with no details, no explanation. Just the fact that after all those years, it was over. What happens when one person controls the story after everything falls apart, and what does silence cost when the world has already decided who to believe? When one voice controls the narrative. Within hours of the divorce announcement, Ruth spoke and her version of events began to circulate, not through angry interviews or tearful confessions, but through carefully chosen words delivered to the right people at the right time, friends who spoke to journalists, sources close to the family, statements that felt measured and reasonable and impossible to argue against. She described a marriage that had run its course, two people who had grown apart naturally, the way couples sometimes do after decades together. No villains, no drama, just the sad inevitable end of something that had once been good. And because Ruth had always been seen as the sensible one, the organized one, the steady presence beside Eamonn's louder personality, people believed her without question. Eamonn said nothing, and his silence became part of Ruth's narrative. Why was he not defending himself? Why was he not sharing his side? Surely if there was more to the story he would speak up, and when he did not, people began to assume the worst, that perhaps he had done something he could not explain away, that perhaps Ruth's calm disappointment was actually remarkable restraint. Ruth did not need to accuse Eamonn of anything specific. She simply needed to position herself as the reasonable party, the one who had tried, the one who had stayed, the one who was now moving forward with dignity while he remained silent and therefore suspicious. And it worked. Public opinion solidified quickly, sympathy flowed in her direction, support from colleagues and fans who admired her grace under pressure. By the time Eamonn was ready to speak, the narrative was already set, and changing a story that has already been believed is almost impossible. But what happens to a person when they are trapped inside someone else's version of their life, unable to move or speak or defend themselves in ways that go far beyond words? Silence as survival. Eamonn's silence was not a choice, it was a calculation. He knew that anything he said would be measured against Ruth's version, dissected by tabloids, twisted into headlines that served whatever narrative sold best that week, and in that environment, silence felt like the only move that could not be used against him. But silence has a cost that nobody warns you about. Every day he did not speak, the assumptions grew stronger, friends stopped reaching out because they did not know what to believe, colleagues became awkward around him, maintaining professional distance in case the truth turned out to be something they did not want to be associated with, and the public, already convinced by Ruth's calm testimony, filled in the blanks with their own worst guesses. He was called cold, emotionally absent, someone who had checked out of the marriage years ago, someone who probably had secrets he could not afford to share, and because he did not deny any of it, people assumed all of it must be true. This is the trap of public silence. It protects you from saying the wrong thing, but it cannot protect you from what others will say in your absence, and once those assumptions harden into accepted facts, they become almost impossible to dislodge. Eamonn watched his own life be explained by people who had never lived it, therapists on morning television analyzing his behavior, relationship experts diagnosing his failures, columnists writing think pieces about what his silence revealed. About masculinity and accountability and the refusal to take responsibility. None of them knew what had actually happened, but all of them were certain they understood. The emotional cost of being misunderstood in public is not just about reputation, it is about watching yourself become a character in someone else's story, a version of you that does not match who you know yourself to be but that everyone else accepts as truth. This is where illness rewrites the rules of a relationship, because needing help makes you vulnerable in ways that love is supposed to protect against, but vulnerability also creates imbalance, and imbalance creates power. And power changes everything. Ruth became the person he relied on, not just emotionally but practically. She drove him places, managed his appointments, made decisions about his care, and at first this seemed like devotion, the natural response of a partner who wants to help. But dependence has a way of shifting the architecture of a marriage. When one person holds all the power to grant or withhold assistance, to decide what is reasonable and what is asking too much, to determine what you are capable of better than you can yourself, the relationship stops being a partnership and becomes something else entirely. Eamonn found himself negotiating for things that should not require negotiation, asking permission for decisions that used to be his own, adjusting his needs to fit what felt acceptable within the new structure of their life together, and slowly, without either of them naming it directly, his body became the justification for everything that followed. Because when someone controls your physical reality, it becomes almost impossible to see when they begin controlling everything else. Care that slowly turns into control. At first, Ruth's involvement felt like love. She researched his condition, booked the best specialists, organized his medication schedule, made sure he was following doctor's orders, and to everyone watching, including Eamonn himself, this looked like exactly what a devoted partner should do. But care and control exist on a spectrum, and the line between them is thinner than most people realize, especially when the person being cared for is too exhausted or too grateful or too dependent to notice when that line gets crossed. It started with small things, Ruth suggesting he should not attend certain events because they would be too tiring, deciding which social invitations to accept on his behalf because she knew his limits better than he did, managing his schedule in ways that felt helpful but slowly removed his ability to make those choices himself, and because her reasoning always sounded sensible, always framed around his well-being, it became difficult to push back without seeming ungrateful or self-destructive. How could he argue when she was only trying to help, when she was the one managing everything while he could barely manage his own pain? This is how control embeds itself inside care. It uses concern as camouflage. Every boundary it crosses is justified by protection, every decision it makes is framed as being for your own good, and if you resist, you are not asserting independence, you are being difficult, unreasonable, failing to appreciate the sacrifice being made on your behalf. Eamonn began to notice that conversations about what he wanted were gradually replaced by conversations about what was realistic, what made sense, what would be easier for everyone, and his own preferences started to feel selfish against the weight of Ruth's practical management of their lives. She controlled his access to the outside world in ways that seemed logistical but had deeper consequences. She decided who he saw and when, how long visits should last, which phone calls were worth the energy and which would only upset him, and slowly his connections to other people began to narrow until most of his social contact was filtered through her first, and the most insidious part was that none of it looked abusive. It looked like devotion. Ruth was praised by friends for her patience, admired for her commitment, seen as a woman who stayed beside her husband through difficult circumstances when many others would have left, but Eamonn was beginning to realize that being taken care of too completely is its own kind of trap. And the trap was not just emotional, it was spatial, because the house they shared was slowly becoming somewhere he could no longer breathe. The house that no longer felt safe. Home is supposed to be the place where you can stop performing, where you can let your guard down and exist without judgment, but for Eamonn, the house he shared with Ruth had become the opposite, a space where every word and movement felt monitored. It happened so gradually that he could not pinpoint when it started. Perhaps it was always there beneath the surface and he only noticed once his world had shrunk small enough that the walls became impossible to ignore. Ruth always seemed to know where he was, what he was doing, who he was talking to, not through obvious surveillance but through the constant low-level presence that comes from sharing space with someone who pays very close attention. She would appear in doorways during phone calls, ask casual questions about conversations she should not have overheard, make comments that revealed she knew details he had not shared. And when he mentioned feeling watched, she framed it as care, as the natural awareness that comes from worrying about someone whose health requires vigilance. How could she not pay attention when he might need help at any moment, when his condition meant that being unaware could be dangerous? So his discomfort became unreal.